Okay, and start.
So we chose to do our presentation on the Second World War. So our main thesis for the presentation was through an analysis of government propaganda, election campaigns, and the mass observation, we can determine how the government influenced how World War II was remembered by the English people. Our primary sources, we used propaganda posters and file reports from the mass observation. For our secondary sources, we used readings from the course, which one of them was ANSI Passive, Regions and Place, Regional Identity and Question. We also used a reading from week 5, Fighting for Britain, Negotiating Identities in Britain during the Second World War. And we used a reading from week 7, Understanding Post-War British Society. So Winston Churchill was the prime minister at the time. He was liberal. During the World War, he helped Britain win it and overcome that hard time. Shortly after the war, a new prime minister was actually reelected, and he was a conservative, and his name was Anthony Eden. And so basically, during the reelection, he mostly focused on nationalism. That was his campaign theme. So the primary source I analyzed was a file report called Note by the Gravesend Election. It basically dissected they asked a small sample of Britain who voted for who, and most people who voted conservative said, yes, I voted conservative, and everyone else basically said, oh, I don't want to say. But we can assume that because people did vote for liberal in that sample, that basically those people were voting for liberal. And so the reading by week 7, the reading in week 7 by Joan Brown basically describes the after effects of Anthony getting elected and what happened. So basically, after Anthony got elected, he started making Britain way more independent. They started projects on building more houses, job security, and also instead of outsourcing goods, they actually made their own transportation system. He tried to make Britain self-reliant, which, yeah. And so basically, he used nationalism to basically create this understanding of the war. He used the war as an event of unity and nationalism in Britain. He wanted people to remember the war as, hey, we did this together, and this is Britain. So that definitely affected people's thoughts on the war.
So the primary source I have chosen is one of the monthly surveys sent out by the British social survey organization, Mass Observation. These surveys were sent out to the public by the government to get their thoughts, opinions, and feelings on the war. The one I have specifically chosen was from December 1939. It asked the public how they feel about the wartime, thoughts on blackout restrictions, what methods they use for blackouts, and a few other questions. So the answers were then released to the public so that everyone could connect and relate during these difficult times. Questionnaires like these let us remember the war by allowing us to see what people had to go through during the war, whether it was losing loved ones, having to cope with the war, and dealing with limited resources. One course reading that supports this is the week 5 reading, Fighting for Britain, Negotiating Identities in Britain during the Second World War. So the government and the mass observation wanted to send out monthly questionnaires to stay in touch with the people of Britain. According to the week 5 reading, mass observation was both a means of observing and reading thoughts and feelings regarding national identity in mid-century Britain, and an integral part of reflections and arguments about what it means to be British at this historical juncture. This statement demonstrates how the government was interested and dedicated in collecting information of the public's thoughts and feelings. This has allowed for the memory of the war to live on and for us to learn.
So during the Second World War, the British government used propaganda to create regional identities that would promote unity between the people of England. Through an analysis of Ansi Passie's article titled Region and Place, Regional Identity in Question, it can be argued that the government created a regional identity through symbolism to influence the way that the war was remembered by the British people. The most interesting aspect of these propaganda posters is that they depict the countryside as opposed to urban centers such as London, for example. As Ansi Passie provides some insight into how this choice created the regional identity the government wanted. Passy states, regional identity is an interpretation of the process through which a region becomes institutionalized, a process consisting of the production of symbolism. The government began this process of creating a regional identity by using the symbol of the countryside. The words below the posters read, "Your Britain, fight for it now," indicating that the government wanted the countryside to be the idyllic symbol of hope for a better future after the war, and in doing so created a regional identity of Britain. Urban centers were the most visually destroyed by the war, so were not used to symbolize national identity. When the government wanted to unite people, it chose to do it with the few places that were seemingly untouched by the war, i.e. the countryside. By making the countryside the national symbol of future peace, the government shaped national identity around a perceptual region that was untouched by the war. Propaganda didn't focus on what they had lost in the cities, but rather the pride they felt in the protection of the countryside. As Passy stated, regional identity provides an answer to the question, where do I belong? The government's answer to this question for the British people was the idyllic, untouched spaces of the British countryside. This answer is highly indicative of how the government wished the war to be remembered. So in conclusion, we analyzed the way that people were attracted to the nationalist election campaigns after the war, and further propaganda and the use of the mass observation as a government tool to show how the government influenced the way that British citizens remembered the Second World War. And here are our references.